Looking back on my childhood, I think an incredibly creepy set of experiences were taking place, but I was too young to understand the gravity. Only now, as an adult, can I sort of piece it together. See, my parents bought a rustic, 14-room farmhouse that was your typical out-in-the-middle-of-nowhere affair. Literally, miles upon miles of farmland, and in the center of it? Our home, like a lot of the properties around us, we had an unusually long driveway. I'd say this thing was about a quarter of a mile long, ending in a T where the road split. Our mailbox was down there, so was a little white fence. From our living room window, we could look all the way down to the end of that driveway. We could see everything from that picture window. And sometimes, at night, we would see things we didn't want to. Some nights there'd be a man down there, he'd be in a car. Parked there, waiting, headlights on. This wouldn't necessarily bother me, like I said, I was a little kid. But looking backward through time and experience, I remember how worried my parents were. How nervously they watched that car, and yet never once picked up the phone to call the police. They never once approached the man in the car. And I think now, they were afraid, because what would happen if things happened? We were far from town, far from help. It was just me and my mom and my dad. And down, about a quarter of a mile away, was a man. A man who may have been thinking about doing something dangerous. Anything, really, even though we never tacitly approached the subject, I guess I knew he was a man. When I walked down the driveway in the mornings to catch the bus, I'd see discarded beer cans and cigarettes. And once, a faded picture of my mother again. I say, this didn't add up much as a small boy. But as an adult, I wonder who that man was, and why were my parents so afraid of him? I guess I should start off by saying I don't in ghosts or spooks. I do believe that creepy things happen and that everything is explainable. But, after this incident, I really have no idea how to explain it. About 5 years ago, I was working as a photographer at a summer camp. I would frequently stay up late at night editing my pictures to make sure they were ready by the end of the week. One night I was in our office working on the photos when my boss came into the office and said that an adult guest broke his ankle, and she had to drive him to the hospital. During this time, they were living at the camp wherever there was space for them. My boss and her husband were going to drive the guest to the hospital, while their 2 kids slept in these elevated tents up on a hill in the woods. They asked that I go up to the tents and hang out until they got back, just to keep watch of their kids. They recommended I bring a blanket and pillow so I can catch some sleep, since they didn't know when they would get back. I walk up the long trail to get to the top of the hill, and find the tent with their kids. I claim a bunk bed and lie down trying to fall asleep. A little while later I see a light coming up the hill towards the tent. I was glad that they had returned so I could finish my work and get to my own bed. As the light came closer, I noticed that something was strange. Instead of a flashlight beam, it seemed to be an orb of light. And it wasn't really bouncing like a person would carry a flashlight, it was just floating up the hill. On top of that, it was a very bright white light. Oh well, I was tired and glad they had returned so I didn't think much of it. The light got closer to the tent, until it arrived at the entrance. Then, the light just sat there, at the top of the entrance, which is about 6 feet off the ground. I thought it was bizarre that they weren't saying anything or coming in. As soon as I directed my phone towards it, the light disappeared. I was confused, but wasn't really worried. Could have been some younger counselors messing around, or the 4-H camp that was renting some space for the week, maybe just kids exploring the property. Plus, I was tired and may have dozed off and wasn't thinking straight. I then tried to go back to sleep. About 45 minutes later my boss returned. I then finished my work and went to bed. The next morning I was thinking about the light and how strange it was. I then realized that the light didn't come to the front of the tent, but to the back of the tent. The back of the tent faced a really steep hill, with tons of trees, brush, thorny plants, and poison ivy. I've tried walking through it in the daytime and it is extremely difficult and dangerous, let alone at night. Then I realized that it didn't make any noise as it came up to the tent. That afternoon I was telling a coworker about what I saw. As I was telling her, her eyes got really wide. She asked me if I was joking. I told her I wasn't. She then told me that the same night she and another coworker were outside the offices at midnight, and they saw someone with a flashlight approaching them. They yelled at it, asking who was there. They got no response. Who's there? Still no response, as the light continues to approach them. They get scared and run into the office, hiding while peering out a window. 15 minutes later it finally went away. When it went away it would have been 12:15 a.m., the same time I saw the light. A few years ago, I lived in an old studio apartment above a bar. One night, I had a friend over and we were up late talking about ghost stories. He told me about some creepy experiences he had ghost hunting at abandoned asylums and such. He left around 3 a.m. and I tried really hard to go to sleep. I was still a little spooked and laid awake focusing hard on the ceiling lamp when suddenly I heard the ball chain click and the light turned itself on. I have never been so scared of a light turning itself on. That doesn't just happen, right? I called my friend instantly and we talked on the phone for a bit, but I was too freaked out to turn the light off or try to sleep. Eventually, as it started to get light out, the ceiling lamp clicked back off. Nothing like this ever happened before or after this. The building was old and there were a lot of weird noises there, but this was an isolated incident. Eventually I moved due to a rat infestation that didn't affect any of the other units and apparently disappeared as soon as I moved out. A friend of mine eventually moved into the unit. She lived there for a year before I see her one day, looking a little freaked out. I ask what's up and she explains that a detective came around wanting to take photos of the layout of the place. I guess 15 years ago, there was a rape/murder of a child in the apartment and the guy who did it was up for parole. She was already freaked out by learning about the history of the place. I didn't want to make it worse by telling her it was also haunted. It's not the most exciting story, but it felt like a pretty strange series of events. I've shared this before, but I think it applies to this topic too. Me and two friends from my squadron went out one night to watch The Hunger Games while stationed in New Jersey. After the movie got out, it was already late at night and the parking lot was mostly empty. We decide to stand around and bullshit while smoking before we start back towards the base. Out of nowhere we see this U-Haul truck come flying into the parking lot. I jokingly say, "Oh shit, I hope it's not a fucking bomb coming after us." Since we had all just got back from downrange. Well, the truck does make a line straight for us. Now we're a little worried about what's going on. The truck comes speeding up to us and stops directly in front of us. The driver looks worried as shit and his wife is not looking any better. They ask us if they can use one of our cell phones because there is a person locked in the back of the U-Haul. We, of course, oblige and call the police for them. While waiting around they explain it's his wife's ex-boyfriend and he has been threatening them for a long time. That's why they were having to move. Well, the ex heard about this move and decided to hide in the back of the truck so he could get them at their new destination. Neither me nor my friends believe a fucking word of this, but we felt we should wait around since we were the ones who called the police. When they finally arrived about 30 minutes later. Not from us calling, the one that showed up was just a random patrol near the theater that noticed us. The driver explains the situation and the officer calls for backup and all that. Turns out it was all fucking true. The police opened up the back of the truck and tried getting the guy out. He fought back and ended up tased. It was a hell of a way to end our night and none of our NCOs believed us, sad face. Granted, after everything and before we left, one of the police actually said your wives and bosses aren't going to believe this shit happened at all.